Good evening. Please welcome Teachers College President Tom Bailey.
Good evening and welcome. You don't know how pleased I am to be back in Millbank at an actual in-person event. So it's wonderful to be here with our guests in person and with the hundreds more of you who are joining us remotely. We're here tonight to discuss the imperative of advancing educational equity and justice and the crucial role leadership must play in bringing to life an emancipatory vision of education. I'm honored to welcome our distinguished guests, Dr. Lester Young, Jr., Chancellor of the New York Board of Regents, and David Banks, New York City's new schools chancellor. And we're proud that Chancellor Banks is an alumnus of the Kahn Fellows Program for Distinguished Principals founded here at TC in 2002. I'm delighted that this event is taking place at Teachers College since it builds on our long and fruitful collaboration and partnership with both New York City and New York State. I'd like to recognize and thank my Teachers College colleagues who are here with us this evening. Dr. Stephanie Rowley, TC's Provost, Dean, and Vice President for Academic Affairs, will introduce tonight's panel in a moment. We have been brought together this evening for this important conversation by Dr. Sonya Douglass Horsford, Professor of Education Leadership at Teachers College and leader of TC's Black Education Research Collective, or BERC. And I want to recognize several other faculty members in our audience who are doing critical work to advance educational equity. I think also we'd like to take a moment to thank the teachers and principals that are here, that also are watching remotely for the work that they're doing, that they're the ones who actually do the things that we're trying to accomplish here today. So thank you to that. At TC, cultivating educational leaders and change makers who are able to powerfully promote and advance equity for marginalized communities is central to our work. Our faculty, students, and alumni pursue educational transformation through innovative strategies for teacher training and principal preparation, by contributing key research to inform policies, and through active engagement in shaping culturally responsive approaches to teaching and learning. Dr. Horsford and BERC are expanding on this work in their role developing a pre-K through 12 Black Studies curriculum for New York City public schools. They're undertaking this paradigm-shifting initiative in partnership with the Eagle Academy Foundation, the United Way of New York City, here with us tonight, and other education equity action plan partners. We are grateful to the New York City Council for funding and supporting this work. And we are grateful to the leadership of Chancellor Young and Chancellor Banks. Their commitment to providing an academically enriching, culturally affirming education for every child is an inspiration. We have much to learn from them, from their insights and experience. So again, we are honored to support your efforts and join alongside you in this essential work. I can't wait to see what we will accomplish together. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Provost Stephanie Rowley.
Thank you, President Bailey, and good evening, everyone. I am so happy to be here in person and certainly to be here with our esteemed guests this evening, Chancellor Banks, Chancellor Young, and certainly our own Dr. Horsford, who's leading such important work here at Teachers College. I had the pleasure of moderating a panel with Chancellor Banks as part of our academic festival this fall. Of course, that was before he was the chancellor, so it's wonderful to have you back. Welcome to TC. Chancellor Young and Chancellor Banks have had such a powerful vision for educational equity and excellence in New York City schools, New York State schools, and beyond. And that vision is one that we share here at Teachers College. Our schools are facing unprecedented times. The pandemic has dramatically widened inequities between Black and Latino youth and other youth. Racial violence has raised urgent questions about what and how we teach. Students are facing a crisis in mental health. Gaps in access and opportunity have deepened in areas far beyond education, but of course their consequences are felt every day in our classrooms. At TC, we're committed to working with the city and the state to address these challenges. As the first and largest graduate school of education in the nation, we're proud of our longstanding partnerships with New York City and with the state to prepare our educators who are change makers in their schools and in their communities. Each year, hundreds of TC graduates are hired into the New York City schools as teachers and principals and counselors, speech pathologists, other administrative leaders. At the Teachers College Community School in Harlem, which was created in partnership with the city, dozens of TC students get experience in the classroom each year. And our TCCS principal, Michelle Verdner, a TC student herself, is here with us tonight. Welcome. Our leadership development programs, including the Urban Education Leaders Program and Summer Principals Academy, are at the forefront of producing leaders with a deep understanding of culturally sustaining and responsive pedagogy and practice. TC's Edmund W. Gordon Institute for Urban and Minority Education, one of the first university-based institutes of its kind, leads the way in developing research and programming and community partnerships that drive educational equity. Our Teacher Opportunity Corps, or TOC as we call it, an initiative funded by New York State and championed by Chancellor Young, is dedicated to recruiting and preparing teachers of color. We look forward to welcoming a new cohort of TOC students just this semester. And of course, we're tremendously honored to be working with the city to develop our groundbreaking pre-K to 12 Black Studies curriculum, which will serve as a model for the rest of the country. We look forward to building on these and other partnerships with the city and the state to ensure New York schools are helmed by leaders with a powerful vision for educational equity and the skills to bring that vision to life. Chancellor Lester Young Jr. began his career in the New York City Department of Education and has vast experience at the city and state levels, ranging from teacher to state assistant commissioner. As chancellor, he's led an initiative to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in schools, in New York schools, as well as the development of a state framework for culturally responsive, sustaining education, which has been instrumental to our own leadership programs here at TC. Chancellor David Banks was the president and CEO of the Eagle Academy Foundation prior to his current role, and the founding principal of the Eagle Academy for Young Men. The Eagle model has since expanded to 6 schools throughout all 5 boroughs of New York City and Newark, and nationally through the Eagle Institute. Chancellor Banks was an early champion and architect of anti-racist approaches to curriculum, teaching, and leadership. As Professor of Education Leadership at TC, Dr. Sonya Douglass Horsford conducts research and teaches courses on the politics of race and inequality in education. She's the co-director of TC's Urban Education Leaders Program, a doctoral program for district-level education leaders, and she's also the founder and director of the Black Education Research Collective, or BERC, our host for tonight, which is devoted to the research on improving educational opportunities and outcomes for Black children. So please join me in welcoming our guest, and now I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Horsford.
Thank you, Provost Rowley. Good evening and welcome to Leading for Educational Equity in New York, the Case for Emancipatory Leadership. The Black Education Research Collective at Teachers College, affectionately known as BERC, is delighted to host tonight's event. And I am personally honored to serve as a moderator for tonight's conversation. BERC is a research center committed to improving the educational conditions, experiences, and outcomes of Black children and youth in the United States and throughout the world. And our core values are grounded in an emancipatory vision of education, guided by 5 tenets. The first being that education is a civil and human right. 2, education is a social and cultural process. 3, education is a calling and valued profession. 4, education is a collective good and responsibility. And 5, that education is the practice of freedom. And so given the tremendous challenges and pressure educators are facing with the continued spread of COVID-19 and racism, and their deadly variants, the field of education leadership must confront the fact that our conceptions of education are likely to never be the same, and that education can serve either as a tool for enslavement or liberation. In addition to embracing the core values of emancipatory education, emancipatory leaders understand that education, as TC's beloved Professor Edmund W. Gordon reminds us, can, quote, contain and control, patronize and co-opt, liberate or emancipate. Therefore, emancipatory leadership should lead us away from strategies of containment and toward conditions favoring democratic freedom. And so tonight I'm honored to be joined by two education leaders who have demonstrated their own personal and professional commitments to educational equity, liberation, and leadership, Chancellor Lester W. Young and Chancellor David Banks. Good evening and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's give them a...
Thank you.
This is a very special night, and we're so delighted to have both of you who have long-standing careers in education and have witnessed major shifts in the field over the years. As we've remained challenged by nearly 2 years of living in a pandemic, what do you believe is the #1 priority for educational leaders in New York State and New York City? We can start with Chancellor Young.
Sure. First, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Horsford, for just having the foresight and exercising the leadership to bring us together this evening. I have said on every occasion where I've had the opportunity that I believe we're in a moral moment now. What we do now will impact thousands of young people all across the state. And it's important that we engage in activities that really are not about rhetoric. It is about making a change. We have an enormous opportunity right now. You talked about the connection between emancipatory leadership and freedom. I think one of our founders once said that a nation that expects to be free and ignorant expects the impossible. And I believe that's still true today. The challenge, quite frankly, is when Jefferson said that, 80% of the population in the state where he said it were enslaved Africans. And so each generation has had to figure out what they would do in that path to freedom, in that path to education, in that path to democracy. And so it occurs to me, particularly when we think about what's going on in New York, that we need the kind of leadership that will address issues like the lack of the equitable distribution of talent. We know that in the 21st century, we still have communities that begin school every year and they start school with vacancies. Right? We know that there are certain communities, and you all know where they are, they have the highest turnover rate of teachers. We know that there are certain communities that don't have access to high quality courses. We know that there are communities where they just don't have high expectations for all of the students. And so it seems to me we're in a leadership moment, and what we need right now are the kinds of leaders that are committed to ensuring that once and for all we build systems that are designed for all children.
Thank you, Chancellor Young. Chancellor Banks?
I also want to echo those comments, and first of all, recognition of all the leadership who's played a role in us being here today. President Bailey, Provost Rowley, thank you so much, and just your leadership, and not only gathering us here for tonight, but the work that you're doing and leading this work around the Black Studies. We'll talk more about that in a moment, I'm sure. I think when you say what is the primary, or the biggest issue that we should be dealing with, to me, it's about what is the fundamental nature of education in the first place. Why do we send our children to school? And to me, it should be about preparing young people to take their rightful place in society. Economically, the reasons why we need to prepare our young people to take their place in the economics of this 21st century economy. Civically, to make sure that they are prepared to be engaged, fully engaged as real citizens. And I would say that as it's currently constituted across our country, we fail miserably at that for most of our children. If you just take for a moment just the notion of civic engagement, every school across America would tell you that they see as their mission preparing young people to be engaged citizens. And we do a horrible job of doing that. I could take you and you could do a random sampling of most students who graduate from high schools across America, and you ask them, what does your local congressman actually do, and how do their actions impact your life? And I would tell you that the majority of them would not be able to answer that to a satisfactory nature. Some of them may have an idea. And don't start asking them about your local city council members and the state legislature, the attorney general, people who have power and influence on their lives. They have no clue, because we don't build that muscle in the K-12 space. Part of that is by design. And so I see the need for us to change that as critically important, to develop young people who are critical thinkers, who are not simply going through what I call a schooling process, which is very different than a process that is actually educating young people. And you can't go through a process like that unless you are affirmed in who you are and understand your place historically, so that you are clear about where you stand, and you know that you stand on the shoulders of people who fought, bled, died, sacrificed, so that you have a deeper understanding with real context around why you sit in the position that you sit in right now. So I think fundamentally we do not do a good job of teaching young people that. In many of our schools today, you could close your eyes and the teacher, it might seem like it's still 1950, except there may be a smartboard in the front of the room. So I think just the essence of what are we trying to achieve is not clearly defined, and so we stay busy in our schools, but not purposeful.
Thank you. It leads to the next question, which is, what is equity? There's been so much conversation, a lot of resources invested in expanding educational equity. How do you define equity? I mean,
equity to me is about ensuring that everyone gets what they need, which is different from equality, right? If you give everybody the same thing, I see that as equality. Equity is when if I'm in need of much more than you are, then that means that government has, as a responsibility, must ensure that you get what you need to get in order for you to be successful. And again, it's a place and space that we fail at miserably. My concern is that there are a lot of conversations about equity which have allowed the narrative to almost be co-opted. And we're not, I think, achieving the goal of creating real equity as a nation for all of our citizens who need to be productive citizens and to be a whole part of this society. Yeah.
Thank you, Chancellor Banks. Chancellor Young, you are responsible for districts and education across the state. Could you tell us
Sure.
about equity from that perspective?
It's interesting when you ask the question, how do I define equity? And everywhere I go, I see these definitions of what is equity. In fact, I'm sure all of you have seen all the posters, right? Children standing on ladders, and some people are lowering the ladder, other people are raising the ladder, and they're all standing behind the fence. And it occurs to me, suppose there was no fence, right? And I think that's part of what we're trying to do when we talk about building equitable systems, that we have a responsibility to take down the barriers. And we have a responsibility to make sure that not only do we give young people what they need, but we give them what they need to be successful at the next level, whatever that is. And I think part of what that means is we have to change the way we think about education. All too often, I mean, if you think about schooling, we spend a lot of time just trying to get kids out of a grade, get kids out of middle school, get kids out of high school. And the question that confronts all of us is, how do we ensure that they have the knowledge, skills, and dispositions that they need to be successful at the next level, whatever that level is? And so for me, equitable systems are fair systems, but understanding that fair is not always equal. And so that's the tension. And that's why leadership is so important, that we have to have leaders that are committed to building equitable systems, understanding that it's not one size fits all. The other piece that I think is often missed when we talk about equity, we can't talk about equity without talking about excellence. And in my mind, excellence is the path to equity, right? The two go together. And all too often, when we talk about building these systems, we forget sometimes that the core mission of our institution is learning. Right now, we can debate how we define learning, but the core mission is learning. And so everything we do in this place called school has to be focused on learning. And so we've got to be very careful that, as the Chancellor said, that we're just not sending kids into institutions and they're just going through the motions. And so they have to not only, quote unquote, be educated, but there needs to be a sense of empowerment. It's in addition to understanding how our democracy is supposed to work, our young people have to know what their role is, that things just don't happen to them. And so what is their role in exercising their birthright to help in that march toward democracy?
And if I could, I want to just add to that a little bit. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier. What is the purpose of education, right? This American educational system was not designed for everybody to win. And we got to be very frank about that. Historically, it was designed for a certain percentage of our population to be fully educated. And so the very notion that we're having conversation about equity is as a result of struggle, because that was not the underlying foundation upon which it was built. We have to continue to fight to ensure that more of us are on the winning side of this. And in fact, everybody should be working toward the winning side of this, to be fully engaged citizens. We continue to lament the fact that so many Americans don't vote, all across the nation. In fact, the majority of voting eligible Americans do not vote. And that is because we do not develop that muscle in the K-12 system. And I think that is by design. And it will only change if the collection of goodwill forces it to change. Everybody's not trying to fight for equity. Because if you ensure that there's an equitable distribution of resources, talent, opportunity, access, For many people, by definition, that means that others are not going to get what they were already receiving. And that politically for people is problematic. But what I see from my lens is that beyond the moral obligation that I think we have as Americans to ensure that everybody has the opportunity to achieve the American dream, if you look at this from an economic standpoint, America will not be able to continue to compete at its highest level with so much wasted human capital sitting on the sidelines. As a nation, we are actually losing in that race steadily because it is a country that is in competition globally on a daily basis. And we've got a whole lot of talent that continues to sit on the sideline while we have these conversations about equity and access. And America will continue to lose in that race unless it recognizes, even beyond the moral standpoint, that economically our nation will not be able to compete at its highest level if we don't recognize that we need to invest in all of our young people to give us the best shot at success.
Thank you, Chancellor Banks. Could you talk a little bit about how you see your administration and your leadership in the DOE addressing that? Like, what are some of the ways that you really want to activate equity?
Yeah, so, you know, I'm just finishing my 4th week. And it's been interesting. I came in at the height of this COVID surge.
You did?
At the end of the first week, we had a snowstorm, and everybody wanted us to close the schools, and we insisted on keeping schools open because we recognize the amount of loss that our children have suffered for this last year and a half and 2 years that they were out of school. Then we had the tragic fire in the Bronx, and we lost so many, 8 young people who died. I went and visited the schools where all the students had attended along with the mayor, and it was just heartbreaking. You know, it's one thing to see it on TV, see their pictures, but it's another thing when you go to the schools and you talk to the teachers who teach them every day and who taught them and who knew them. And one teacher came out and he read a letter, that one little girl in the 5th grade who had just died in the fire, that she had written to him. And she said to him, you're the best teacher I ever had, and I thank you for being a great person. And when I get older, she said, when I get older, I want to be, you know what she said? A kind person because you've been so kind to me. And it wasn't a dry eye in the house. And I think about a young lady like that whose life was tragically snuffed out. But I also think about a lot of our children who are in our schools whose promise and potential gets snuffed out, and they're living and breathing every day. So what am I trying to do from the seat that I'm sitting in? I have every intention of reorganizing the Department of Education so that it has as its focus the true purpose of what I see education being about, and helping to develop the gifts that every child has. We have a $38 billion budget. That's 38 with a B that we spend every year. And yet 65% of black and brown children never achieve proficiency in our school system. It's an act of betrayal. It's not just something we should try to fix. It's an all-out act of betrayal that needs to fundamentally change. I want to ensure that every child who goes through the school system no later than the 3rd grade can read on grade level. Because all of the research has shown us that if you don't learn to read by the 3rd grade, we're fighting an uphill battle afterwards. And we spend an inordinate number of resources just to try to correct what we should have gotten done in the first place. The work that you're doing and leading on this Black Studies curriculum is critically important, because not only does every black child in our school system need to have a deeper understanding about who they are, every child in New York City needs to know who we are and understand the contributions that African Americans have made to the development of this nation. Here's what happens when you don't. Drew Brees, who was the quarterback of the New Orleans Saints, made a comment when he was still a quarterback. He said, I could never take a knee during the national anthem because my father and my grandfather fought for this country. In making that comment, he was implicitly suggesting that my father and my grandfather did not fight for this nation. And when it was brought to his attention that, in fact, the first person ever died in the American Revolution was a black man, he said, I had no idea. Why would he have known that? He was never taught that. And so for white kids and everybody else, they also need to know the contributions that we have made. And it's not just black folks. This is a multicultural society where people have, of all races and backgrounds, have made contributions. But if the only thing you hear about is through one particular prism, how educated are you? That has to change. Those are the kinds of things that I intend to see change. And I want young people ultimately to know, why do you go to school in the first place? I want them to know the power of possibility for themselves, for careers that are happening on the other side of this schooling experience, that you understand it's hard to dream of being an investment banker if you've never met one, right? And so many other career opportunities for our kids. But many of our teachers don't know. Many of our teachers have no idea what it means to work at a place like Google or Microsoft or to be in the biotech industry. So I intend to also work to re-engineer a level of professional development for our teachers so that they understand what that world looks like that we say we are preparing our children for. So it's a number of things that we're going to be focused on, but give me at least another month.
All right, we'll check back in another 4 weeks, see how it's going. Thank you. Chancellor Young, Chancellor Banks mentioned, the need for preparing and supporting teachers as well as leaders, I would imagine. Can you talk about the work that you've done in developing the culturally responsive and sustaining framework and how you see that as being perhaps a tool or way to encourage and support the development of culturally relevant educators?
Sure. So I want to go back to something I said earlier, and Chancellor Banks touched on it. The first thing we have to do is recognize that the system that we currently have is a system of maintenance, and it really is not designed to ensure that all young people can be successful at what I call the next level. And so if you just look at the curricular practices, the hiring practices, the assessment practices, the discipline practices, all of that points to what I'm saying. And so the first thing that we have to do, and what I think at the state level we have to do, is ensure that we have the kind of policies in place that drive the behaviors of adults that bring out the best in young people. And so I believe that part of my responsibility as Chancellor, I have to stay in my lane. And so the role of the Board of Regents is really to set policy. So what are the policies that we need to address? In May of this year, we passed the state's first diversity, equity, and inclusion policy. And what we've said, quite frankly, is that the policy is foundational to everything that we do. So, when you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's interesting to me that as people, I hear people talk about it, they say DEI, DEI, as if it's a program. In fact, I had a superintendent say to me, I want you to come to my district so you could see DEI. and I laugh, but it's sad. Because for many people, that's how they're thinking about it. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are three different things, right? And so we have to be very thoughtful and very targeted about what we're talking about and why we're talking about it. The other thing we have to understand, I said it's a system of maintenance, but here's the sad part. New York has some of the best schools on the planet, but all young people don't have access to them. And so we have to think about, well, why is that? And how do we build high-performing systems for all students. See, that's, to me, the real challenge. So that was really what was behind our diversity, equity, and inclusion policy, and we've said that it was to look at 6 areas, and one was governance. We understand, and I, quite frankly, you know, I've been a superintendent, I've been a principal, I'm now a policymaker, but I believe there is a role for governance, right? You know, there are 780 school districts in New York State. All of them, with the exception of one, are governed by school boards. The school boards make decisions. They determine who the superintendent is, what the curriculum is, what the standards are, what the policies are. So they drive education. So we need to be concerned with that. We want to look at the whole area of teaching and learning, and everything from educated workforce to curriculum to professional development. That's why the Black Studies curriculum that's being developed in New York City is so important. There's not a district in New York State that hasn't come to me in the last year. I've been the chancellor for a year this January. And people come to me and they say, well, and it's interesting, lots of people will say, they think that New York City is the center of the universe, right? And they will say, well, what are they doing in New York? We know they have the curriculum in New York. I said, no, they don't. Right? And so part of the work that BERC will do will inform what we do for the entire state, and I dare say the entire country, because many states where they do this, they make it optional, right? It's an elective course. And so we believe, at least at the state level, that diversity is good for all young people. We have said that it's not just in the curriculum, it's got the workforce needs to reflect the diversity of our state. That's why we were able to invest in the Teacher Opportunity Corps initiative, of which we have one here. In fact, one of the largest Teacher Opportunity Corps programs is right here at Teachers College. And the good news is that we're planning to expand it. The bad news is this. Everyone thinks that the TOC program was part of the budget. You know, we've been talking about diversity, and this is what I mean by maintenance. The reason why we have a Teacher Opportunity Corps program is because New York State remains the only state to enact My Brother's Keeper in the state law with a budget. And so we were able to take the funds out of the My Brother's Keeper initiative to support Teacher Opportunity Corps. And why did we do that? We went all over the state of New York when we were thinking about My Brother's Keeper. And everywhere we went, whether we were in Long Island, whether we were in Bed-Stuy, whether we were in Rochester, we began our public forums with a panel of high school students. And everywhere we went, the high school students talked about how their education would have been different had they had teachers that looked like them. And so we took that to heart, and we said that if we were to have a My Brother's Keeper initiative designed to improve outcomes for boys and young men of color, that had to have as a major component a diverse workforce. And so we have TOC. The other is this whole notion of cultural responsiveness. And I'm going to say what I think I've heard, maybe it was Gloria Latson-Billy say, that quite frankly, cultural responsive teaching is just good teaching. That's what it is. It is beginning with what's familiar with young people. It is understanding and respecting that there is something called cultural wealth. It is that we have to see young people in the context of the family, and the family in the context of the community. It is when we work with institutions of higher education, understanding that we have to challenge them to take the institution out of the core and put families, students, and communities at the core, right? So it means there's skin in the game for everyone. And so our notions around cultural responsiveness really speak to how do we ensure that we have environments that are welcoming and affirming to young people, that build their esteem. And we believe the curriculum is a good way to do that. We believe that these environments have to be in a state of continuous renewal, professional renewal, so we know that we have to have systems designed to build the professional skills of teachers, right? That not all of our teachers truly understand the various cultures of our communities, and that takes time. We know that we have to have the kinds of instructional practices and assessments, and everywhere I go in school districts, people are always talking to me about the state assessments. But I do understand that in this moment we need systems that build deeper learning, and so part of that means we have to have an assessment strategy that's designed to get at deeper learning. And so for me, the whole notion of cultural responsiveness is really about how do we build systems that are designed to ensure that all young people are receiving a high-quality education, and we're giving them everything they need to do that.
Thank you, Chancellor. I have so many more questions for you, but we also have questions from the audience. So we're going to turn to those in the audience, starting with a question from Gia Calderon, who is a Teachers College Community School student. She's in the 8th grade.
Oh, wow.
And so we are glad to invite her to ask her question. Welcome.
Good evening, Chancellor Young, Chancellor Banks, and Dr. Horsford. It's such an honor to meet you. My question to you all is, how can you help ensure teachers teach us about people of color in a more positive light instead of just victims of slavery? I believe we are so much more, and my peers and I know that there are people of color who have made amazing contributions. We just haven't learned much about them. So I was just wondering how you can ensure that we will learn about them later.
Thank you for your question,
Thank you.
Gia. Chancellor
You might
Banks,
want to
you want
start
to answer
with
that?
that one. No?
I can.
The work of BERC.
Well, yeah, thank you for that question. This is precisely what we're trying to address through the development of the Black Studies curriculum. We're excited that that is being piloted right now at your school as well as Thurgood Marshall Lower Academy School. And so we are making that happen now. We definitely agree that we need to, as Chancellor Banks mentioned, make sure that all students see themselves in the curriculum and that we really understand the truth about the history of this country, as well as having a better understanding of the different cultures that make us who we are. So we thank you for being here and for your question, and we will be checking back with you in about, I don't know, maybe at the end of the year to see how that is going, but we thank you for your involvement and your leadership at your school. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, our next question is from Cherise Bino. And Cherise is a doctoral student in our Urban Education Leaders Program, and she is in the process of starting her dissertation work, and so she has a question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horsford, and thank you to both chancellors for being here. Chancellor Banks, in addition to preparing education leaders to lead schools, divisions, and districts throughout the DOE and the state, what role should research centers play, like BERC, and colleges of education like Teachers College, in supporting PK through 12 systems and institutions?
So I thank you so much for that question, and good luck in your pursuit of your doctorate as well.
Thank you.
I want to acknowledge also, joining me here tonight is Carolyn Quintana, who is our Deputy Chancellor in charge of teaching and learning. So if anybody has an opportunity to chat her up, I appreciate if you would do that. And we talk about this kind of stuff all the time. And I think that the schools of education, and rather various universities all across the country, have a role and a responsibility, I think, in helping us to figure out, first of all, what are we doing? Are we getting it right in terms of what we intend to do? But also, with the data that you collect, to help us chart a better and deeper path forward. You know, a lot of times when practitioners are doing the work and they're just in it every single day and don't necessarily have the lens, the greater lens that researchers have. And you help us understand when we're on the right track and why we are on the right track. And you also help us to understand what are those questions that we're not even addressing, that we haven't thought about, based on the data that you collect as institutions and research institutions that can better inform how we are moving. We don't want to just be busy. We want to be intentional about what we're doing. And I think when you merge the work of the practitioners together with the institutions who do real research, the marrying of those two, when you have the right leadership in place, that's when you can begin to have game-changing moments. And I think that's what is represented in this work that BERC is doing. I think intuitively we all know that we're not learning enough about the history of people of color, and particularly African Americans in this country. Almost everybody would tell you that. But how do you develop something that will be impactful? What does that look like pre-K all the way through the 12th grade? It will look very different across grade levels. And we need the researchers and the work that you're doing and the work, and you're bringing people together from around the country who are really looking at this and helping to develop a path forward. That's when we have the best chance of getting it right, when you marry the two.
Thank you. Well, we certainly agree, and we think that through research practice, partnerships, a lot can be accomplished, so we're excited to hear you.
Dr. Horsford,
Yes.
may I just,
Yes,
may I
yes,
add? Here's the other thing that happens in K-12 systems, at least all across New York State. We're very good at collecting data, right? You know, I visit schools and classrooms, and teachers have piles of data on their desks. And here's the challenge. A lot of the decisions that we make, they're not informed decisions. So what am I saying? We now know more about early learning and early development than we did 10 years ago, 15 years ago. However, that's really not reflected in the schools. If you visit the schools and school systems, very rarely do you hear people talk about 0 to 3. Well, you know, that's a complete contradiction to the science of learning and development. What about this idea of reading by 3rd grade? You know, if you visit school districts and you talk to them about how they're teaching reading, they will tell you about a program or a textbook or some other ideological thing, but it's not informed. And it just occurs to me that we have a real opportunity here working with the academy to try to figure out how do we make informed decisions about the work that we do each and every day.
Very important. Very important. Thank you. And we have a question now from Dr. Rosa Rivera-McCutcheon, who is an Associate Professor of Education Leadership at Lehman College.
Thank you all so much for being here and for the wonderful conversation. Chancellor Young, there have been some moves at the state level in New York and really across the country to eliminate references to equity, and I just wanted to hear what your thoughts are about that. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. New York, like other states, are experiencing all-out assaults on the truth. And that's the easiest, that's the kindest way for me to describe it. The other thing that's occurring, and just indulge me a moment, because of the way the politics of the New York State legislature, you know, we're not in danger of the legislature passing laws the way other states have done. But here's what's occurring at the local level. Many of these groups are running school board members. And the way they're doing it, they're actually, it's like they bum rush the school board meeting. they threaten people, and then they put candidates up to run. And in some places, they're actually running and winning. And when that happens, they control the curriculum, they control the superintendent, they control the hiring practices, on and on and on. And what I would say is this. We have an obligation, I believe, as leaders, and this is part of the emancipatory leadership, to not be silent. We have a responsibility to call this out. We have a responsibility to call it out for what it is. We have a responsibility to tell the truth. It seems to me that the wrong thing to do would be to do nothing. And so I would hope that centers like BERC would be places where we could talk about how do you deal with some of these things? You know, how do you respond as the leader to groups that come into a meeting that you're having and just try to take over? You know, when I talk to superintendents now around the state, what they're saying to me is that they were never prepared to deal with this, right? And so it occurs that they need a safe place where they can come and talk about it. Many of them, by the way, actually work in districts that are resisting what they see as the change. You know, so these are very real problems. This is serious business that we're in, but I think that we have to stay the course, and it's part of what I said earlier. Each generation has had to decide whether to fulfill their destiny or betray it. And I think that that's part of where we are right now.
Thank you. It's a big charge, but it's one that I know we're committed to addressing here at BERC. So one of the questions that we received from the audience is, in a climate of many priorities, and we've covered quite a bit of them, what do you suggest is one step a school leader or a district leader should do to make meaningful progress towards equity in school communities? What's one thing that they can do?
I think that one step would be to make a personal commitment yourself as a leader to more deeply understanding what the issues and the challenges and the problems are, listening to all sides, and just making a commitment that you will try to study and learn more about what's really going on, having those kinds of conversations. When the young lady who was in the 8th grade, who was so poised, so articulate, she got up here and presented her question. Talk to young people. Find out what are they saying, what are they thinking. Demonstrate a level of profound respect for the families in the communities that you serve. Talk to them. Don't assume that you know the answers. And don't assume that they all agree with each other either. Right. You know, I've found during these turbulent political times that a challenge I've made to my own self is to try to be open to hearing what all sides are saying, and don't just assume that the position that I'm already taking is one that should be unchanged because, you know, it's what I feel deeply. People who are storming those meetings also have a position. They have a point of view. Even as uninformed as I might think that it is based on something. And at least showing them enough respect to hear what they're saying. I have found that for me personally as a leader, I've found that to be helpful. Because if people think that you're not even hearing them at all, they ratchet up even deeper. And then the divide is just that much deeper. I try as a leader to do everything that I can to at least hear what everybody is saying and to show a level of respect to everyone in doing that. And then by doing that, I think that I'm informing my point of view that much more. And there are lessons to be learned on all sides of the aisle.
Right.
And so that would be the one thing that I would say, even for teachers, for principals, administrators, just try to deepen your own personal understanding of what some of these issues are, because it's hard to lead. Anybody can lead if you're just working on your own point of view and you just assume that you're right and everybody else is wrong. But if you at least try to be open to what everybody's saying, and sometimes even when people disagree with you, they will appreciate the fact that you've at least opened yourself up enough to hear their point of view.
It makes me think of the work of one of our faculty colleagues here at TC, Nicole Furlong, who directs the Klingenstein Center, and the listening leader, because we kind of focus on the actions that leaders take, but not the fact that we need to listen, just to listen and be able to be reflective. Thank you. Chancellor Young, one thing that a school leader or a district leader could do.
Well, it's interesting. As Chancellor Banks was speaking, I was thinking, and I think he's absolutely correct. When you listen enough, you understand that you at least need to respect other people's truths. And I think you have to do that. But I also think if there's one other thing that leaders need to do is be very clear about what their expectations are. All too often, and again, you know, this comes from my work around the state. What I hear quite often is people will say things like, well, I didn't know that's what you wanted. Or I didn't know that's what you meant. And I think a lot of that comes from our inability to be clear about our expectations and our beliefs. And I think that we have to do that. We have to be in a position to talk about, well, what do you believe? You know, when I became chancellor, one of the things I said in the acceptance speech is that we needed to have a new possible for all children in New York State. And I wasn't just giving lip service to that. I was serious. You know, when you look at all young people, what do you think is possible? What do you see? And I think what you see is based on your beliefs. And I think we have to talk that through, because I don't think we all see the same thing. And I think part of leadership is how do you galvanize your culture, your community around a vision of what is possible, right? And one of the challenges in leadership is just this idea of how do you change culture, right? How do you get people to behave differently? That is a challenge. But at the same time, you know, it's interesting. I think Baldwin has a quote. He says, the thing that pulls you forward into the future is the same thing that pulls you back into the past. And so for me, you know, when I think about what drives me forward, I also think about the people who've influenced my thinking. And so when you talk about Edmund Gore and James Comer and Asa Hilliard and people, and Ron Edmonds, and people who not only had a theoretical approach, but were really talking about some of these things we're talking about tonight 40 and 50 years ago. Right? And we often lose sight of that. We don't even talk about that. We act as though, you know, we've discovered some of these things. You know, I remember reading some of Jacqueline Irvine's early work on cultural synchronization, right, and understanding. And then when I listened to the students speak, and essentially what she was saying way back then is that we have to be in sync with our students. right? Doesn't that make sense? But how many of our leaders actually know that? And so again, that's why BERC becomes so important, right? That there is a legacy here that we have to live up to.
And I'm so glad you invoked those names, because that's the work that BERC wants to bring forward and make sure that leaders are familiar with that scholarship and those theories and those practices, which are embodied in a lot of ways in the culturally relevant approaches, but aren't named.
And you know, those are significant names. They stand as heroes and sheroes for us. They stand as names of inspiration. And sometimes the reason, as Chancellor Young said, we don't continue to evoke those names is because they're not always so present to the next generation of folks. That's why I salute those who are even engaged in the struggle of trying to name a place like this after Dr. Gordon. Dr. Gordon turned 100 years old, and he's been a hero to so many, and it's what we know is that he won't be here 100 years from now. But perhaps if his name was on this building, the legacy of what he has left will stand for 100 years and more. And people who are yet unborn will ask the question, well, who was Dr. Edmund Gordon? Right? And we can direct them to a place. You see, so those are symbols. Symbols matter. And the work of somebody like a Dr. Gordon, it's not meant just as a testament to him, but it's meant as a source of inspiration and knowledge for those who are coming after. That's what legacy represents. That's why it's so important. That's why it's not just the work of BERC and Black Studies just for the sake of it. It's what it means to serve as inspiration, as consciousness lifting, which helps you understand who you are, whose you are. And for young people to understand that they stand on the shoulders of people like Dr. Edmund Gordon is critically important.
That's right.
Yes,
And may I just, I'm sorry, are we?
Okay, we're good.
Okay. I guess that's no.
No, that's yes, Chancellor.
Okay. So here's the other reason why this is so important. You know, there is a school of thought in certain circles in our business that will say that we don't need community, we don't need families, and we don't need culture. And let's not act like we haven't heard it. And there are those who are saying that essentially we just have to tear them down and build them over again, as if our children are broken and need fixing. And then we have the work of Edmund Gordon that speak to affirmative development, and we have to say that if you're an urban educator and you don't know who he is and what he said, then how do you counter that single story narrative? Right? And so that's why this is so important. So when we talk about the importance of something like emancipatory leadership, we're really talking about our survival, right? As all of us. That's right. Not just some of us. And so that's why this work is so important. And so I think, again, at least from my lane, that we have to do all that we can to encourage this kind of center, this type of an approach, as we think about how do we build the next generation of leaders.
Thank you. Do we have time for a couple more questions? Okay. And we just want to give a shout out to Professor Gordon. I believe he's watching. So
Absolutely.
We appreciate you so much. So a question from the audience is around the DOE, and it's how will the New York City Department of Education practice emancipatory leadership? What changes in structures, policies can we anticipate?
That's a great question.
Now that you're 4 weeks in.
Yeah, now that I'm 4 weeks in, right, yeah. No, I intend to refocus how all of our leaders are trained, developed, supported throughout the entire school system. I think the very notion that leaders have been trained to think that the only thing that matters is that they are instructional leaders within the four walls of the school, I think is a flawed frame. Schools are part of communities. They were never designed to simply exist as silos within a community. Our children walk through a neighborhood to school. They walk through a neighborhood from school. When Saturday and Sunday happens, they live in their neighborhood. Schools are part of communities, and community voices should matter. The people who lead those schools need to understand what are all the other forces and factors within that community that affect the children that they're serving. Who is that owner of the bodega on the corner? You need to know who that is. Who is the commanding officer of the local precinct? You need to know who he or she is. You should have their personal cell phone. So if one of your students has any kind of issue or comes into any form of confrontation with a police officer, you should know who they are, and they should know who you are. You should already have built relationship that will work to benefit that child and their family. There are so many factors, the local library in the neighborhood, the Boys and Girls Club. All of these institutions play a role in impacting our kids. And, I know many principals who engage in walking the neighborhood of a school, getting to know the kids, visiting, going to their homes and meeting them wherever they happen to be, and knowing what are the cultural institutions in that community. And so there are just so many ways for us to deepen the understanding of our leaders, and that's what I'm committed to doing. I've just hired a new Deputy Chancellor for leadership, and I selected him because he not only has the background that I believe is necessary as a level of emotional intelligence that I think is going to be critically important, but for us to reimagine what leaders should be and how they ought to show up for our students. It's critically important. And the leaders themselves have lots of ideas about how to do this. That's another thing, that you recognize that the best ideas don't always come from the top down. In fact, most of them do not. That if you see leadership through the prism of the bottom up, I believe that most creative solutions, a level of just innovation, and this is not just in schools, it's across every industry, really happens from the bottom up, not the top down. The role from the top should be to create an ecosystem of support and trust that says, we invite you. This is a shared space and a safe space for you to bring your best and brightest ideas, and that we will create a way for us all to learn and to grow together. Far too much of what happens in the Department of Education is that it has been a top-down management system, and nobody moves unless they're directed, except for what my new Deputy Chancellor of Leadership says are the educational outlaws. Those who become successful and figure out how to make things happen for their kids in spite of the Department of Education. Now think about that you even have to move that way. And that's how most effective leaders move. They don't move because of the department, they move in spite of. They figure out how to move around it and through it and over it and everything else. Can you imagine if the Department of Education was really a place that fosters innovation, that invites them to be creative on a regular basis? You'd have a very different dynamic. That's the dynamic that I'm trying to create.
Wonderful vision. It's so refreshing to hear about leadership that's not only focused within the building or within the system, but that's really engaging community. So it's nice to hear that as part of your vision. Chancellor Young, did you want to speak to?
Well, I'll just summarize. I believe that educational leaders have to be community leaders. I mean, that's what I think. I think that if the pandemic has taught us anything, use the word ecosystem. The school has become the ecosystem in the community. A lot of the anchors in communities that many of the communities of greatest need, those anchors don't exist anymore. It's the school. And so the school became the place that provided 3 meals to young people. It provided child care for parents while they went to work. It provided emotional support services to students that were experiencing traumatic occurrences. And also, it tried to deal with the core mission, learning. And so it just occurs to me that if you see the connection between school and community, you can't just be the school leader without being the community leader. I once had occasion to talk to a high school student. They were describing their school, and I said, well, tell me, why you feel this way about your school. And the student said, well, we're like a family here. And I never forgot that. She said, we're like a family. I said, what do you mean? She says, well, they look out for us. They said, if I have a problem, I can call my teacher at night. Now, that sounds, some people might say that's a bit provocative. Call your teacher at night. But if we understand the history of education of some cultures in America, we know that that's exactly what happened. That's how many of us got here, right? Because there was that kind of relationship. So I believe that that starts with understanding what is the nature of community. And I'll just go a step further. I think this, maybe I shouldn't telegraph this, but I will. I think that the whole internship experience for school leaders and teachers, that's where we get it wrong. I think that part of that practicum experience should be spent in community-based organizations. It shouldn't just be in the school.
Right.
And that does a couple of things. It helps the practitioner understand the values of the community, but it also begins to form a partnership between institutions of higher education and the community, which I think is also important. So yeah, I think that one of the policies that we're thinking about is how do we change the nature of the leadership internship so that it's of more value.
Yes, that's a great point.
There was a mention about, you briefly mentioned trauma, which we know is a major issue. Was before the pandemic, but now has just been exacerbated. How can New York schools address trauma and racial trauma and its effect on students?
The response to trauma is, the best response to trauma is always about trust, and it's about relationships. And at the core of any good school is what Chancellor Young just said in an example that he raised when he spoke to the student who said, my school is like a family. Right? Students who are in places like that have that type of culture, those are the students who are always best served. And all of the international studies have demonstrated to us over and over again that relationships in schools are what foster students who are able to develop a spirit of resilience in the face of trauma. This pandemic, as a news flash, was not the first time that our kids have faced trauma.
Yes,
and it certainly won't be the last. And so one of the things I know that we're looking at is how to expand on teaching kids practices that they can center themselves in the face of trauma. Practices like mindfulness, which for some people they see that as a touchy-feely, nice, cute kind of thing to do. But when you recognize it for what it really is, it is a lifelong skill that you learn that can help you as you face adversity and challenge along the way. Some of our most successful business folks have learned mindfulness. And what mindfulness really means is, how to be still, how to be able to bring calm to your own spirit and your own thinking, kids who lash out violently in response to trauma and challenge are young people who have not learned the skills of how to be calm, how to settle, how to think before you act, because that's all it really means. But that's a skill that can be taught, and it's a lifelong skill. And I just feel so good as I've visited schools all over the city during this first month in this position, to see young people, I mean, in kindergarten, first grade, before they even start their day, who are centering themselves. And it's not just like a cute thing to look at. If it's done right, it's a skill they can take with them for the rest of their lives. And it helps you to concentrate. It helps you to focus. And you can learn it in a whole host of ways. I remember when David Dinkins was the mayor years ago. He was early on in his tenure as mayor. And he was celebrating in the Blue Room at City Hall a group of young folks from Harlem who had just won the statewide chess competition. And it was a guy named Maurice Ashley. He was a chess master, and he had taught all these young people how to play chess. And Gabe Pressman, the famed journalist, was alive at the time, and Mayor Dinkins was in the middle of the whole Crown Heights issue and everything else. And so they gave these young people this award. And then Gabe Pressman asked the mayor, he said, he asked the young people, he said, it was meant to be a throwaway line. He said, you guys have any advice for the mayor on how to deal with some of his current challenges? And everybody kind of laughed, and nobody expected a response. And the young man who was 13 years old, he was the captain of the chess team. I'll never forget this. He stepped forward when nobody expected him to actually answer the question. It was just meant to elicit some laughs. He stepped forward and he said, and he got very serious, and he said, I would advise the mayor, everybody sat back and was like, whoa, what's he going to say? He said, to assess the situation, take a step back, weigh all of his options, and then make his best move.
Come on now. That's the chess champion.
This was
right
the
there.
chess champion. You see what I mean? So what it was an example of, again, it was almost a form of mindfulness.
Yes.
It was a young man whose mind, he had developed a discipline mentally through the playing of chess, which said, no matter what the challenge, step back, assess, make your best move. If we could teach young people to have that level of mental discipline, it's a skill that they can take with them for the rest of their life. Those are the kinds of things that I'm trying to figure out, how to bring that to all children to learn those kinds of skills.
We need to start with us, right?
That's right. That's right. Absolutely.
Thank you. Chancellor Young, do you practice mindfulness?
No, I don't. But here's what I think. I think Chancellor Banks is correct. And allow me to say this. I've had the chance to work with and work for several New York City administrations. In the 4 weeks that the Chancellor's been in office in his position with the mayor, I would say that they have been, as a team, more responsive to the needs of young people in New York than any other administration. Now, I don't know whether that's just the truth. And so for me, as the Chancellor of the Board of Regents, I think we're in a very unique opportunity to make something happen that we weren't able to make happen before. The other point that I would make about the current leadership is when Chancellor Banks founded the Eagle Academy, and people either they don't know or they don't want to know, but when he first had the idea for the Eagle Academy, we were at a moment in New York City where people were saying things like, well, you can't have an all-boys school. and they were giving all kinds of reasons why. And I recall at the time, there weren't a lot of voices of support for this, but Chancellor Banks stood his ground. So for me, he's always demonstrated the kind of leadership that was more about action than about rhetoric and talk, and I think that that's exactly what we need now. So as someone who's been part of the system, see, I believe we do need models, right? I think whether it's mindfulness or whatever the model is, because what I worry about, I'll be quite honest, what I worry about when we talk about mental health and trauma, when I talk to districts, what they say to me is, well, we're going to hire more social workers or psychologists. And here's the challenge. You know, communities that have been the victims of bad policies doesn't mean that they're full of bad adults and broken children. And we've got to be very careful that, you know, trauma is part of the human condition. You know, and so the question of, are we just trying to identify more children and label them, or are we trying to help them and give them the tools that they need so that they can survive these traumatic episodes and instances? And so for me, the question becomes, what are the models to do that, right? And if it's mindfulness, it's mindfulness. But what are the other models? You know, and are there things that we can do? And quite frankly, there are never going to be enough social workers and psychologists to give to all the children. And so what are the things that we need to do school-wide to build the kinds of nurturing and supportive cultures that young people need?
Well, we are at time, but I just want to thank both of you for being here tonight for such a wonderful and inspiring and enlightening conversation. And thanks to both of you for being models of leadership, emancipatory leadership. And we look forward to continuing to work with you. And we want to thank
Thank you.